We imagine Erwin Rommel behind a map table, coolly directing armies across the desert fox, calm, calculating, master of armoured warfare. But most mornings, Rommel was doing something no army commander should ever do. He was personally piloting a reconnaissance aircraft over enemy lines while his staff waited nervously below. Field Marshal Kesselring complained that Rommel acted like a divisional commander, not an army leader. Other generals thought he'd lost his mind, but that habit, the one his superiors couldn't understand, reveals something about Rommel the propaganda never showed. The general who couldn't stay grounded. Rommel's day began around 4 in the morning, hours before most commanders even stirred. While his staff slept, he'd climb into a Fieseler 156C Storch, a small reconnaissance plane designed for short takeoffs and low-altitude observation. Then he'd fly himself over the battlefield. Not with a pilot, himself. He'd circle enemy positions, study the terrain, note troop movements and supply routes. The Storch could fly low and slow, hugging the contours of the desert floor where faster aircraft couldn't follow. Rommel used this capability relentlessly, sometimes spending hours in the air before the sun had fully risen. By the time other commanders were having their first cup of coffee, Rommel already possessed first-hand intelligence his staff couldn't provide. He'd seen the ground with his own eyes. He knew what the maps couldn't tell him, the wadis that could hide an ambush, the ridgelines that offered defensive positions, the supply depots the British thought were concealed. This wasn't normal behaviour for a general commanding an entire army. Senior officers don't fly combat reconnaissance. They review reports. They consult with intelligence officers. They maintain the kind of strategic distance that allows them to see the whole picture rather than getting lost in tactical details. A commander who gets killed on a reconnaissance flight leaves his entire army leaderless. But Rommel couldn't command any other way. He needed to see everything himself, and that obsession would define both his greatest victories and his ultimate failure. The smallest headquarters in the Wehrmacht. Back on the ground, Rommel ran an operation that would have horrified any military bureaucrat. His headquarters staff was shockingly lean: 1 or 2 general staff officers, an engineer, an artillery officer, a naval liaison, and a personal aide. That was it. No bureaucratic layers, no extensive planning departments, no comfortable distance from the fighting. Compare this to a typical army headquarters of the period. British and American commanders maintained staffs of dozens, sometimes hundreds of officers. They had intelligence sections, logistics divisions, communications units, and planning cells all working simultaneously. Information flowed upward through layers of analysis before reaching the commanding general, who then issued orders that flowed back down through the same structure. Rommel rejected all of it. He wanted speed, and bureaucracy was the enemy of speed. Every evening, he'd dictate detailed operational reports to his aides, preserving orders, maps, and coloured chalk sketches of troop movements. These weren't dry military documents. They were Rommel's personal record of each day's decisions, complete with the reasoning behind them. He understood that history would judge his campaigns, and he wanted his own version preserved. This efficiency impressed everyone who witnessed it. Rommel made decisions faster than any commander in North Africa. He could pivot entire divisions while British generals were still waiting for reports to filter up the chain of command. His opponents never knew where he'd strike next, because even his own staff didn't always know. But this efficiency came at a cost his admirers rarely mention. Rommel was doing work that should have been delegated to junior officers. While he was flying reconnaissance and sketching maps, his staff bore the impossible burden of planning entire campaigns without him. They never knew where he was or when he'd return. They couldn't reach him when they needed decisions, because he was usually somewhere near the front lines, completely out of contact. His chief of staff would draft plans for operations Rommel hadn't approved, hoping to guess correctly what the commander wanted. Sometimes they guessed right. Sometimes entire plans had to be scrapped when Rommel finally returned with different ideas. The army functioned despite this chaos, not because of it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Rommel's daily routine, hit subscribe. We break down history's most fascinating figures every week. The strangest form of relaxation. Here's where Rommel's routine becomes genuinely bizarre. In his spare moments, what little existed between firefights and planning sessions, he memorized logarithm tables. Not for tactical calculation, not for artillery ranging, for mental exercise. Other generals relaxed with music, letters home, or conversation with their staff. Rommel sat alone, drilling mathematical tables into his memory. He treated abstract calculation as a form of recreation, the same way another man might treat a crossword puzzle. His aides found it unsettling, their commander muttering numbers to himself while battles raged nearby. This wasn't a general winding down after combat. This was a man whose brain physically couldn't stop working, even when the guns went quiet. He needed problems to solve, constant problems, every waking minute. If the war didn't provide them, he'd manufacture his own. Some psychologists might call this compulsive. Others might see it as the mental discipline that made him formidable in battle. Either way, it reveals something essential about the man behind the legend. He was incapable of rest. His mind never disengaged, and that relentlessness would eventually consume him. His letters home to his wife Lucy show a man who couldn't separate himself from warfare, even in private correspondence. He'd describe battles in loving detail, then mention almost as an afterthought that he hoped she was well. The war consumed every corner of his consciousness. There simply wasn't room for anything else. The prisoner's cigarette. When captured, enemy officers arrived at his headquarters. Rommel's behaviour surprised everyone who witnessed it. He didn't hand prisoners to interrogators. He gave them cigarettes. He invited them to meals. He attempted to establish rapport through conversation rather than coercion. British and Commonwealth officers who expected harsh treatment instead found themselves sitting across a table from the Desert Fox himself, discussing tactics over dinner like colleagues rather than enemies. One British officer captured in 1942 later recalled his astonishment at Rommel's courtesy. He'd expected the worst. The propaganda back home painted German commanders as brutal fanatics. Instead, he found himself discussing the finer points of armoured warfare with a general who seemed genuinely curious about British training methods and tactical doctrine. Some historians read this as genuine chivalry, the old-fashioned officer's code that supposedly separated Rommel from the brutality of the Eastern Front. Others see manipulation. A skilled interrogator knows that prisoners reveal more over a shared meal than under a bare light bulb. Rommel got intelligence that formal interrogation would never have extracted. But either interpretation points to the same truth. Rommel wanted to understand his enemies personally. Not through intelligence reports, not through captured documents, face to face, officer to officer. His intelligence came from human contact rather than paperwork. He'd study their expressions, note their reactions, listen to what they didn't say as much as what they did. By the time dinner ended, Rommel often understood his opponent's thinking better than any formal interrogation could have revealed. He learned how British officers were trained, how they made decisions, what they feared, and what they respected. This knowledge shaped his tactics. He knew exactly how to create the kind of chaos that paralysed British command structures, because he'd learned those structures from the men who operated within them. The addiction. He couldn't break. But Rommel's personal touch had a darker side, because what happened after those prisoner conversations reveals a man who couldn't stay behind the lines, no matter the cost to his own army. Unlike most commanders who maintained appropriate distance from frontline combat, Rommel personally visited critical sectors every afternoon. And he didn't just observe, he took over. He'd direct individual companies and battalions, making tactical decisions that should have belonged to captains and majors, officers who knew their own men and their own terrain. Rommel would sweep in, issue orders, then disappear toward another crisis point before anyone could question him. Picture the scene. A battalion commander has spent days positioning his forces, understanding the ground, developing a plan that accounts for his unit's specific strengths and weaknesses. Then Rommel appears in his command vehicle, surveys the situation for 20 minutes, and orders a completely different approach. The battalion commander has no choice but to comply. This is the army commander speaking. But he's now executing a plan he didn't develop, using tactics that might not suit his unit's capabilities. This created chaos throughout the Afrika Korps command structure. His staff couldn't plan operations because they never knew what he'd already changed. Junior officers couldn't develop their own judgment because Rommel made every important decision himself. The army became dependent on one man's presence, which meant it fell apart whenever he wasn't there. Against unprepared British commanders in 1941 and early 1942, this worked brilliantly. His speed and aggression overwhelmed opponents who expected predictable German doctrine. He'd appear where no commander should be, make decisions faster than the enemy could react, and disappear before they understood what happened. But against Montgomery's well-organised 8th Army, his chaos couldn't compete. Montgomery didn't need to outthink Rommel. He just needed to impose order on a battlefield where Rommel thrived on disorder, and wait for the inevitable mistakes. The propaganda general. By evening, a different Rommel emerged. The frontline commander became something far more unusual for a German general, a media personality. In October 1942, Rommel held his own press conference, an almost unheard-of move for a Wehrmacht officer. German military culture emphasized quiet professionalism, not public self-promotion. Generals were supposed to serve in anonymity, letting their victories speak for themselves. Rommel rejected this tradition entirely. He strode into the room and declared that today we stand 100 kilometers from Alexandria and Cairo, and we have the gates of Egypt in hand. The statement was militarily optimistic to the point of delusion. His supply lines were stretched to breaking. His tanks were running on fumes. The Royal Navy controlled the Mediterranean, sinking the cargo ships that should have brought him fuel and ammunition. El Alamein would soon prove that the gates of Egypt were firmly shut. But Rommel understood something his fellow generals didn't. The war of images mattered as much as the war of bullets. While other commanders avoided journalists, Rommel cultivated them. He posed for photographs with his iconic goggles pushed up on his cap. He gave interviews that emphasized his daring and his personal leadership. He built a legend that served Nazi propaganda perfectly. The chivalrous warrior, the clean general, the knight of the desert. Goebbels loved him. Here was a general who understood media instinctively, who created compelling narratives without being coached. The German public adored him as a symbol of military excellence. Even the British developed a grudging respect that bordered on dangerous fascination. Churchill had to warn Parliament against creating a cult around an enemy commander. Rommel understood media warfare instinctively, decades before other military leaders grasped its importance. He was building a brand while his peers were simply fighting a war. The Nazi general. But behind the legend was something the post-war myth wanted us to forget. The comfortable narrative says Rommel was apolitical, a pure soldier untainted by Nazi ideology, a professional who served his country without embracing its crimes. This version made everyone comfortable after the war. The Allies could respect a worthy opponent. The Germans could claim at least one general who remained honourable. Cold War politics encouraged rehabilitating German military figures who might be useful against the Soviet Union. But Goebbels wrote in his diary that Rommel was not only politically close to National Socialism, he is a National Socialist. This wasn't casual observation. Goebbels understood Nazi true believers better than anyone. He'd spent years identifying who genuinely supported the regime and who merely tolerated it. His survival depended on reading people correctly, and he counted Rommel among the faithful. Rommel developed genuine political sympathies for the regime throughout the 1930s. He embraced the military opportunities Hitler provided, the rapid promotions, the resources, the freedom from the old Prussian military establishment that had dominated Germany's officer corps. He accepted command of Hitler's personal escort battalion during the 1939 Polish campaign, a position that required ideological reliability, not just military competence. You didn't guard the Führer unless the party trusted you. His fame served the propaganda machine, and he knew it. He participated willingly in building the myth. He understood that his celebrity helped the regime, and he accepted the bargain. The chivalrous enemy narrative was convenient for everyone after 1945, but it wasn't the whole truth. The body's betrayal. By late 1942, Rommel's punishing habits were destroying him from within. Amoebic dysentery struck first, a consequence of the harsh desert conditions he insisted on sharing with his men. The infection ravaged his digestive system and left him weakened for months. Then chronic sinusitis, aggravated by the dust storms he flew through every morning. His head ached constantly. He couldn't breathe properly. The desert air that he'd once relished became torture. Finally, dangerous blood pressure problems that left him dizzy and exhausted. Some days he could barely stand. His legendary energy, the force that had driven him through 18-hour days for months on end, simply wasn't there anymore. His austere lifestyle, which his own staff complained made their work even harder, had pushed his body past its breaking point. He refused special treatment. He ate what his soldiers ate. He slept in the same conditions they endured. He set physical demands so extreme that he eventually couldn't meet them himself. The man who expected commanders to be more robust than their troops was being hollowed out by his own standards. His legendary energy began to fail. He became irritable, erratic, and occasionally unable to focus during critical meetings. Doctors urged him to take leave, warning that his health was deteriorating rapidly. He refused, and when he finally did return to Germany for treatment, he came back to Afrika sicker than when he'd left. His body was breaking down, but his mind couldn't accept limitations. The final strafing. On July 17, 1944, Rommel's frontline habits caught up with him permanently. He was travelling near Sainte-Foy-de-Montgomery in Normandy. The irony of that name wouldn't become apparent until later, close enough to the front that Allied aircraft regularly patrolled overhead. This was exactly the kind of position a senior commander shouldn't occupy. Other generals travelled with anti-aircraft escorts and stayed away from contested airspace. Rommel was in an open staff car. His driver spotted the planes too late. Royal Canadian Air Force Spitfires dove on the vehicle, their guns tearing through the car and sending it careening off the road into a ditch. Rommel suffered skull fractures and severe brain injuries. He was thrown from the vehicle and found unconscious in a ditch, bleeding from wounds that would have killed a lesser man. For days, doctors weren't sure he would survive. The injuries ended his command in Normandy and effectively ended his military career. The man who'd survived years of self-imposed danger wasn't brought down by enemy strategy or tactical defeat. He was grounded by the same routine that had made him legendary. He'd spent a decade putting himself in harm's way, insisting on seeing everything firsthand, refusing the protective distance that other commanders accepted. Eventually, the odds caught up. The routine that made and unmade him. So what did Erwin Rommel actually do all day? He flew his own reconnaissance before dawn, circling battlefields in a slow-moving plane that made him an easy target. He memorized math tables for entertainment because his mind couldn't tolerate rest. He shared meals with prisoners to understand his enemies personally. He directed companies when he should have commanded armies, undermining his own staff in the process. He cultivated journalists while the propaganda ministry watched approvingly. And he pushed his body until it simply couldn't continue. His daily habits created both his legend and his downfall. The same obsessive frontline presence that made the Desert Fox terrifying to face also meant his army couldn't function without him. The same relentless drive that won stunning victories also burned through his health in months rather than years. The same contempt for bureaucracy that allowed rapid decisions also left his staff struggling to maintain any coherent planning. The myth remembers the genius, the tactical master who ran circles around slow British commanders. But the routine reveals the man. Brilliant, compulsive, politically compromised, and ultimately consumed by his own inability to step back. He couldn't delegate. He couldn't rest. He couldn't stay behind the lines where a commanding general belonged. These weren't simply habits, they were compulsions that shaped every victory and guaranteed eventual failure. And in the end, that wasn't strength. It was the limitation that destroyed him. Thanks for watching History Hangover. If you found this video insightful, check out our other deep dives into World War II's most controversial military leaders. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next upload.